Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Her Song is a Sin, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lou1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by me, Britt. Her Song is a Sin, Chapter 6. Riel inspected the limo, showing Helen how to search for tracking devices or worse, bombs, when Scylla and her crew stepped over to the vehicle. They were dressed as usual, but Scylla had some sort of cape wrapped around her, and the blonde gave her a questioning look. "Are you wearing that to dinner?" "We're not going to dinner," Garrett said, and moved to open the door of the limo for Scylla. "Garrett," Riel said, her voice annoyed. "Where are we going?" "Beltane," he replied simply. Riel looked at Helen, who shook her head at the blonde. "Nightclub," she mouthed. After everyone had settled into the limo, Riel slammed her own door, jaw tight. It was obvious that she had been the only one left in the dark about this little outing. She knew that Scylla was still pissed over the trees, but this was just ridiculous, and dangerous. All the way to the club, the bodyguard seethed. Riel felt like she had swallowed a hot molten stone as they pulled up to the club. This was every bodyguard's nightmare. The crowd surrounding the nondescript warehouse called Beltane was huge. People spilled out of the loading dock that served as the club's main entrance and perched on the fire escape system attached to the building on the other side of the alleyway. Beside her, Helen searched for a place to put the limo, while Riel's mind raced as she tried to come up with various exit strategies on the fly. She turned her head back to help Helen with positioning the limo and took in the mood of the other occupants in the vehicle. Directly behind her, Porter looked green, and she could only assume that he was just as nervous as she was at the idea of Scylla soon being among the reaching and grabbing fans. Someone smacked hard at the limo's window, and Garrett jumped with a nervous laugh. "Come on, guys," he said at the crowd that couldn't really hear him. "The show's inside." In the back of the limo, Scylla shivered, not at being practically naked under her cape that hid her sequined costume, but with the energy she could feel from the crowd. Beltane held such great memories for her. She had shed her pain and cried her heart out on the simple black stage, and the fans had ate her up. They lifted her and carried her to the fame she now had. It was a thrill to be here, and launching her newest video for her biggest fans. Byron sat beside Scylla, unhappy with Garrett and his harebrained idea to do an impromptu performance at the club and then to deliberately leak their intentions a couple of hours before his sister was set to go on. The move had created a mob, and that's exactly what the publicist had wanted. Only Isadora seemed quiet, almost oblivious to the various energies around her. Scylla jumped out of the limo as soon as Riel opened the door for her and moved past the bodyguard, avoiding the blonde's attempt to stop her. She called out to the fans on the fire escape and grabbed a Sharpie from someone in the crowd to sign various photos and some body parts thrust under her nose as she made her way into the side entrance of the club. Riel moved around her, attempting to clear the way while Isadora, Byron, and Porter followed on her heels. Garrett had already entered the club briefly, shouting an explanation that he needed to talk to the owner as she dashed past Riel. Once inside the narrow hallway at the side of the entrance of the club, Riel ushered Scylla to a small dressing room near the stage. The room was already packed with flowers and cards and various stuffed animals that fans had left for the musician. Riel made sure Porter was standing guard at the door and left Isadora and Byron with the brunette inside the dressing room as she stepped out to secure the area. She went back outside and spoke with Helen about where to park the limo for the best quick exit. Once they talked and decided on a plan A, B, and C, Riel and the driver checked their comms devices to make sure that they were working properly. Satisfied as Riel could be with the impromptu security measures, the bodyguard returned to the club and wormed her way back towards the dressing room, walking past Garrett, who was fending off reporters to his left and right. At the door, she gave Porter a curt nod before pushing it open. The moment she stepped inside the small, cramped space, she could sense the change in the atmosphere. Scylla sat on a stool in front of the dressing room mirror, her eyes wide and her previous excitement gone. Riel looked to Isadora, who thrust a doll in her hands. The doll looked just like the one that Scylla's brother had found in the studio, complete with a witch hat and noose. The only difference was that this one had gruesome disfigurations, as if the plastic on the doll had been burned, giving the face a waxed, melted look. She looked around for a note and found it in Scylla's hand. Byron paced back and forth in the cramped space and spoke up. They sent another one. A loud noise came from the door and everyone jumped as Garrett stepped inside, a bouquet of flowers in his hands. Nothing else comes in here, Riel said, grabbing the bouquet and thrusting it back out the door and in someone's reaching hand. At her perch in front of the dressing area, Scylla looked back and forth among the blank faces of the only people in the world with whom she gave her trust. Voice tight, she asked, "What do you mean, another one?" No one spoke for a moment, and then Isadora began talking, and the others joined in, the confessions falling from their lips. As Byron explained about the first doll, Scylla interrupted him. "Somebody got in the house? The studio?" She looked around, and then her eyes landed back on her brother. Her voice was a shout, and Byron cowered. "Someone touched Mother's piano?" Riel locked the dressing room door and stepped forward, crouching down to meet Scylla at eye level. She gently took the note from the brunette's shaking hand. "They didn't tell you," Riel said simply. Scylla met the blonde's gaze, her blue eyes desperately seeking answers. "You knew?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "It's why I'm here," Riel answered, "to keep you safe." Another crash came from beyond the dressing room, and Riel stood up, hands instinctively reaching for her weapon. Scylla watched the blonde, terror filling her eyes. The owner of the club stuck his bald head in the room, having unlocked the door with his keys. Oblivious to what was happening inside the dressing room, the manager looked at Scylla, a smile on his lips. "There's my sexy little witch." Scylla flinched at his choice of words, echoing the note she'd read attached to the hideous doll, but the owner didn't notice and carried on. "Are you about ready to go on? The natives are getting restless out here." "Maybe you shouldn't," Isadora said quietly. The owner's brows shot up, and Garrett surged forward. "Just give us a minute, Dave." The manager bobbed his head and backed out of the door as Riel shifted to block it. Scylla looked at Riel. "Is who sent this out there?" "They could be," Riel answered honestly. "We don't know that," Garrett said. "But you all knew that someone was sending me stuff like this." Scylla looked around the room, the pain of betrayal in her eyes. "You knew someone got into the house." "We need to cancel," Byron said. Isadora nodded. "I'll go tell them." "Wait!" Garrett shouted. "If you do that, they'll rip the damn place apart." He turned to Scylla, taking his hand in hers. "Come on, babe. This is what you've worked for. Besides, you've got Riel here, right?" The bodyguard sighed. "I'm here," she confirmed, and then looked to the brunette. "But I don't recommend that you go on." "I'm canceling," Isadora declared, and walked out to the stage. Everyone started moving at that point, and Riel helped Scylla to her feet, the bodyguard starting to guide her out the door when the sound boos made Scylla pause. The crowd was going nuts, but not in a good way. They were disappointed. "Wait," Scylla said, coming to a stop. "Scylla, you don't have to do this," Riel said. Shrugging out of her bodyguard's grasp, she shook her head. "Yes, I do." All Riel could do was follow the girl and whisper frantic instructions to Helen through the comms. By the time Riel got back to the side of the stage, Scylla had set her hello to a roar of screams and stomps, which was the unique way her fans always greeted the musician. Isadora walked back to Rael, shaking her head sadly, but any words she spoke were drowned out as the music started. Scylla whipped off the cape she was wearing to reveal her costume, and the crowd went wild as she began to sing and to dance. From the sideline of the stage, Rael watched. It was the most sensual thing that she had ever seen. Her throat was dry, and she felt the very pulse of the beat in her innermost core. The sexual need she felt was almost tangible. She swallowed, her eyes fixated on Scylla as she sang and danced to the crowd. Rael's stomach tightened and her jaw clenched. She had a job to do, keep her clients safe. She swallowed down her desire, forcing herself to focus, not on the siren in front of her, but of the crowd beyond. As she searched for potential threats, Garrett stepped up into her personal space. "Are we having a problem?" "What?" Rael asked, shouting over the music. "I said I hope we aren't having a problem," Garrett repeated. "That's what she's meant to do." The publicist pointed at the brunette on stage, who had invited a few men and a couple of women to join her. Rael started to step forward, intending to throw them off the stage when Scylla caught her gaze and gave her a firm shake of her head. The bodyguard stopped, and Garrett continued. "I know you are supposed to keep her alive, but none of that matters if she's dead. If you don't let her do what she's meant to do, forget a cycle with a doll or a nut job with photo edits. If she doesn't get out there and sing and win awards, she's dead anyway." As the tempo changed and Scylla began a new song, she faltered as one of the men on the stage put an arm around her waist and swung her around, her back facing the crowd. Early on, when she first started performing at clubs, Garrett had actually hired plants to do this very thing. It was a way of generating excitement as the star left the stage and joined her crowd. Now, though, she could see that this was no plant, and her voice turned from song to scream as her body was pushed down into the groping hands of the crowd. Rael reacted immediately, shouting into the comm system and rushing forward. She jumped off the stage and into the middle of the crowd. She kicked, elbowed, and punched at the mob as she fought to get a hold of the brunette. As soon as she got to Scylla, she pulled her from the crowd and took her in a fireman's carry to the alley exit that was her and Helen's exit plan B. She had tried to yell at Porter as she moved through the crowd, but he had gone ahead, bulldozing through the mob to the side exit that they had entered. The crowd was still grabbing at Scylla, and she had no more time to try and get the blonde's attention. Outside of the club, Rael opened the limo door and placed Scylla inside. She climbed in beside her. The brunette was shaking uncontrollably, and she had started to cry. Rael took her suit jacket off and placed it around the brunette as she held her in her arms, rocking the singer back and forth. She wasn't even sure what she was saying. She just knew she wanted to comfort the girl, her entire world having been upended in a few short minutes. Rael asked Helen to park the limo as close to the entrance of the mansion as possible. As soon as it came to a stop, she hopped out and reached back inside the limo to help Scylla out. The brunette was still upset, tears streaming down her face, her normally beautifully blue eyes red and swollen. Without a second thought, Rael lifted the girl into her arms and carried her into the house and up the stairs. She'd only been in Scylla's bedroom one other time, when she had done the necessary security assessments, at the start of her employment with the musician. Now she carried the brunette into her room and helped her to stand by her bed. She found a light on the bedside table and flicked it on, casting a soft glow in the room. The room was full of books. They filled the shelves that lined the wall. They were stacked on the floor in some spots, and there was at least 4 on the brunette's bed. Carefully, she swept them aside and pulled down the covers on the bed. "Don't you want to know?" Scylla asked, voice shaky. "Know what, Scylla?" Rael asked, her voice revealing her exhaustion. Looking back at Scylla, she could see the tears still glistening on her face. "Don't you want to know why I do it? Why I act that way?" "I know why," Rael answered simply. The blonde slipped her suit jacket off of the brunette's shoulders and helped her out of her costume. The fabric was torn in several places, and Rael had the irrational desire to burn the offending garment. Somewhere in the mob, Scylla's shoes had been lost, so her feet were already bare. She slid her hands over the brunette's hips and down her legs, slipping off her tattered hose. Once Scylla was clad only in her underwear, she helped her into bed and pulled the covers up around her. "Please don't go," Scylla called out, as Raelle took a step back from the bed. "I won't go far," Raelle promised, moving to Scylla's bathroom. Inside, she got a washcloth and wet it with warm water. She could hear Scylla's sobs even over the water running in the sink, and her heart wrenched at the sound. Once she'd wrung out the cloth, she returned to the brunette and sat gingerly beside her. Reaching with the cloth, Raelle worked at removing the brunette's running mascara and cleaning her tear-stained face. Satisfied after a few moments, the blonde put the washcloth on the bedside table and settled back on one of the pillows. She stayed with Scylla until her soft sobs grew quiet and her breath evened out as the brunette fell asleep. Porter was pissed. Actually, that was an understatement. As the man huffed into the quiet mansion a couple hours later, after the fuck-up that was Beltane, he knew that he was enraged. And it was all that blonde's bitch fault. It was his job to be there for Scylla. His duty to rescue her and show her how he really felt. Instead, that damned bodyguard had something cooked up with that dyke Helen, and just as he had cleared the way for Scylla to be saved, he had found himself surrounded by laughing and jeering fans as he looked out to an empty street. The bitch had moved the limo and didn't tell him. Now she sat in Scylla's kitchen, cutting up an apple and munching on it as if she was just enjoying a late-night snack. The closer he got to her, the more he wanted to make her pay for being able to do what he had never done. As he rushed forward, Raelle shot out an arm without even looking up, blocking his attack. Raelle had sensed Porter's approach, and his roar of anger gave him away as she stood from the chair and blocked the taller man's attack. They scuffled for several minutes, Porter lunging and Raelle parrying his weak punches. Tired of him not getting the point, Raelle swung a leg out and dropped him to the ground. Before he could get up, she'd moved the chair on him. The foot rested on his neck, choking him. She put her weight on the chair until Porter was gagging and waving his arms. "This stops now," Raelle said, her voice ice. Porter managed to nod, and after a few seconds, Raelle gave an answering nod. She lifted the chair off the blonde's neck and put it down by the counter. She bent over, picking up some of the shards of broken glass that had fell to the floor with their scuffle. She dropped them into the trash, careful not to cut herself. She heard a soft sound beside her and turned to find Porter facing her, a large knife in his hand. She looked at him, eyes a question. "Really?" He gestured at her vaguely, a come do your worst motion, and Raelle couldn't resist a small smile. Porter's eyes bulged at Raelle's expression. He was still angry, but there was something very calm and very deadly the blonde's smile that made him pause. He didn't even see it. He just heard it as the knife she'd been using to cut the apple sailed past his ear and embedded into the wall behind him, less than an inch from his ear. Hands shaking uncontrollably, the knife he held fell to the floor. Raelle watched him, her eyes turning from annoyance to pity as she spoke. "If you really care for her, stop fucking it up. Work with me. I'm not the enemy here." Porter swallowed and nodded his agreement. He was still shaking and holding on to the kitchen counter for support. "We never speak of this again," Raelle said with a shrug, and walked out of the kitchen. Scylla didn't go anywhere for several days after Beltane. Instead, she escaped to her books and to her plans. She tried to keep away from everyone in the house. She shied away from the smug publicist, even though Garrett continued to flit about insisting that the concert had been a success despite her colorful exit. Isadora had tried to talk to her about the ramifications from the event, but Scylla only offered her a curt thanks when the talented manager explained that she had put a quiet end to some legal complaints by offering free tickets and swag to fans. She'd even discreetly paid a few medical bills because apparently Raelle had broken a few noses in her rush to get to Scylla and rescue her from crazed fans. There were only a couple of people that she didn't have to outwardly avoid. The first was her brother. As soon as he'd got back to the mansion via an Uber the night of Beltane, Byron had locked himself in his studio. Ashamed, that he hadn't gone behind Garrett and ensured that Scylla had been told about the very serious threats that had been made against her. Riel was the second person she didn't need to avoid. The blonde had checked in on her again in the morning after, and then quietly backed away. She made it a habit to silently appear whenever Scylla was on the property just to check on her, but she didn't try to engage the brunette in conversation. Instead, she merely watched, ensuring her physical safety, while giving the brunette space. Sometimes Scylla noticed an emotion in the blonde's gaze that she couldn't recognize. Now, as Scylla reclined in a brightly colored hammock on a more lush part of the grounds, book in hand and blanket to keep her warm from the September chill, Scylla could feel those pale blue eyes on her. She heard the rustle of dried leaves on the ground as Riel stepped closer, but kept her gaze on the open page of her book. The sound grew louder as she felt the presence of her bodyguard beside her. Scylla's breath caught as the blonde spoke. "Nice hammock," Riel said softly. The musician looked up to see Riel smiling down at her, and she couldn't resist returning the gesture. "Bit cool to be out here, though," the blonde continued, shivering in her pink flannel hoodie. Scylla said nothing, and after a moment Riel reached up with a hand and awkwardly squeezed at the back of her neck. The brunette thought that nervous Riel was still very endearing. After a few minutes of silence, the bodyguard tried again, pointing at the book. "Reading anything good?" Scylla smirked and decided to throw the blonde a bone. "Yeah, it's a history of Shipton Hall and Anne Lister. Helen might have mentioned something about someone parading around here pretending to be her." "Oh," teasing, Riel responded. "Today I feel more like Virginia Woolf." "Is that so?" Scylla asked. The wind swept through the trees, making the fall leaves dance around them, and she shivered in the hammock. "Yeah," Riel answered, letting her eyes roam over the musician. "It's getting colder out here." She put a hand out, offering to help the brunette. "Walk you back?" "Only if I get to be your Vita Sackville West," Scylla answered. A few seconds later, Riel gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Scylla looked into the pale blue eyes of her bodyguard, and she saw that emotion again. There was affection in her eyes, and there was a undercurrent of one too, but Scylla couldn't be certain if it was the blonde's or her own desire she saw reflected back to her. The vulnerability of the moment made her ache somewhere deep inside. It was a need, but not necessarily sexual in nature, at least not fully. It wasn't something that she'd felt in a very long time. She handed Riel the book and her blanket and got out of the hammock. Once Scylla was beside her bodyguard, she reached for her book and carried it as Riel held the folded-up blanket under one arm and slipped her other around the brunette's waist. Together they walked back toward the mansion, chatting quietly about poetry and historical lesbians. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own, and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.